All right, so ready to jump into a fascinating topic. We're doing a deep dive into global inequality today. The whole haves and have-nots thing on a global scale.
Definitely. It's one of those big questions that keeps coming up. And luckily, we've got a great book to help us unpack it. Why Nations Fail.
Yeah, I've heard good things. It dives into the power of institutions, right?
Exactly. The authors argue that it's not just about geography or culture that determines a nation's fate, but the institutions, they build the rules of the game, so to speak.
Interesting. So it's less about the hand you're dealt and more about how you play it based on the rules in place.
That's a great way to put it. Think of it like this. Imagine two countries, both starting with similar resources and potential, but one has institutions that promote fairness, opportunity, and a level playing field. The other, not so much.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. The country with the better institutions is probably going to end up in a much better place, right?
Precisely. It's like one country is playing chess and the other is playing checkers. The rules, the possibilities, the entire strategic landscape are completely different.
That's a great analogy. So how does this actually play out in the real world? Got any juicy historical examples for me?
Oh, tons. The authors of Why Nations Fail are all about using history to illustrate their points. One that always makes me think is their analysis of the Black Death.
Okay, starting with the plague. That's a bit intense. But I'm intrigued. What's the connection to global inequality?
Well, think of the Black Death in 1346 as a massive system reset, a critical juncture. Imagine history as this river flowing along. Sometimes a critical juncture is like a huge earthquake that diverts the river's course, leading to completely different landscapes downstream.
Wow, that's a powerful image. So it's not just about the plague itself, but how different regions reacted to it, how their institutions adapted or didn't.
Exactly. Take England and Eastern Europe. Both devastated by the plagues, but their outcomes, worlds apart. In England, the huge loss of life actually empowered the peasantry. Fewer workers meant they had more leverage.
Oh, interesting. So they were in a better position to bargain for better conditions, to demand more rights.
Precisely. It led to the decline of feudalism and planted the seeds for a freer labor market. There's this great story about Incham Abbey, where the peasants basically told the abbot, hey, ease up on the crazy demands or we're out of here.
No way. Did the abbot actually agree?
He did. It illustrates the power shift that was happening. Meanwhile, over in Eastern Europe, lords used the plague to tighten their control, eventually leading to something called the Second Serfdom. Same plague, opposite outcomes.
That's wild. Same crisis, but totally different responses and long-term consequences. It really highlights how these turning points, these critical junctures, can solidify or disrupt existing power structures.
Absolutely. And it shows how those small differences in institutions, often emerging from moments of crisis or upheaval, can have a massive impact on a nation's trajectory.
So it's not always about some grand plan or preordained destiny. Sometimes it's about those small choices, those seemingly insignificant differences in how societies respond to challenges.
Exactly. It's like those choose-your-own-adventure books we read as kids. One seemingly small decision can send you down a completely different path. And England's story after the Black Death is a great example of how those early shifts toward more inclusive institutions, those small differences, really mattered. They helped set the stage for them to become a global economic powerhouse a couple of centuries later.
Okay, so we've seen how a crisis can solidify inequality, but what about those moments that break the cycle? England's story after the Black Death sounds like it holds a clue. Hit me with it. What happened next?
Oh, fast forward to 1688, and you have another turning point, the Glorious Revolution. And this wasn't just a simple change in leadership, it was a seismic shift in power dynamics.
Oh, yeah, I remember learning about that. Wasn't that when power shifted away from the monarchy to parliament?
You got it. And that was a huge deal because it meant a wider swath of society had a voice in how things were run. And that paved the way for what the authors call inclusive economic institutions to emerge.
Okay, so I've heard that term before, inclusive institutions, but I'll be honest, it sounds a bit jargony. What does it actually mean for everyday people?
It's a good question. Think of inclusive economic institutions as the opposite of a rigged game. They're about leveling the playing field, creating opportunities for more people to succeed, not just those at the top.
So not just the same old boys club calling all the shots.
Exactly. It means things like secure property rights, where you know your farm or business can't just be seized on a whim. It means protection against unfair taxes that bleed you dry. and it means dismantling those stifling monopolies that crush competition.
Okay, so it's about creating a system where more people have a fair shot at building wealth and getting ahead, not just those born into privilege.
Got it. Exactly. And one of the best examples of how this played out is the story of James Watt and his steam engine.
Oh, yeah, the steam engine. Wasn't that one of the big game changers of the Industrial Revolution? What does that have to do with inclusive institutions?
Everything. Watt's genius wasn't just in inventing the steam engine itself, but in the context he was operating in. England's more inclusive institutions meant there were systems in place to protect his invention through patents.
Ah, so he could actually profit from his hard work and ingenuity. That makes sense.
Precisely. He had the security of knowing his ideas wouldn't be stolen, and a market that, because of these inclusive institutions, was more open to embracing new technologies.
Mm.
It's a real-world example of how the right institutions can unleash innovation and fuel economic growth.
Okay, I'm picking up what you're putting down about institutions being the key. But it also makes me wonder, if inclusive institutions are like this magic formula for prosperity, why didn't the Industrial Revolution just sweep across the globe, lifting all boats?
You've hit on a crucial point. The spread of the Industrial Revolution wasn't like dropping a pebble in a pond and watching the ripples spread out evenly. It was more like planting seeds in different types of soil, some fertile, some rocky, and that's where those small differences we talked about, those institutional variations, really come into play.
So it's not just about having the right ideas or inventions, like the steam engine. It's about having the right environment for those innovations to take root and flourish.
Exactly. The book goes deep into how different parts of the world reacted to the Industrial Revolution and why some embraced it while others got left behind. A good example of this is comparing North and South America.
Oh, interesting. I've always wondered about the stark differences in prosperity between North and South America. They were both colonized by Europeans, yet they've had such divergent paths. What happened there?
Well, think about it. The U.S. and Canada, even though they had their own unique journeys and challenges, were largely building upon the legacy of English common law and political systems. They inherited some of those institutional building blocks that we talked about earlier, things like respect for property rights and a more market-oriented mindset.
So even though they were new nations finding their footing, those seeds of inclusivity were already present, like baked into their DNA from the start.
Exactly. And as they developed, they generally built upon those foundations,
Yeah.
creating systems that, while imperfect, fostered innovation and allowed for broader economic participation. Though Latin America, different story. They were saddled with a legacy of extractive institutions, which is basically the opposite of what we've been talking about.
Okay, remind me again, what do we mean by extractive institutions? It sounds, well, kind of ominous, like something out of a scary movie.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's not a pretty picture. Imagine a country where a small, elite group hoards all the resources and wealth, like a vampire squid draining the life out of its prey. That's essentially what extractive institutions do to a nation. And sadly, that's the system that the Spanish conquistadors imposed on much of Latin America centuries earlier.
So while England and its former colonies were riding the wave of the Industrial Revolution, Latin America was stuck in a system designed to benefit a select few at the expense of everyone else.
It's a tragic pattern, and sadly, it repeated itself across history and across continents. These extractive institutions were like quicksand for progress. They actively discouraged innovation and prevented broad-based economic participation. It's like trying to run a marathon with your shoelaces tied together. They never really stood a chance.
That's heartbreaking. It makes you wonder how differently things might have turned out if they'd had a more level playing field from the get-go. But were there any exceptions to this pattern in Latin America? Any glimmers of hope that managed to break free from that extractive legacy?
Well, one of the most striking examples the book gives is Argentina, which is a really interesting case study. You see, while Argentina itself gained independence and made some strides toward progress, its northwest region remained mired in poverty. Why? Because it had been so deeply integrated into the Spanish colonial system that those extractive institutions were deeply entrenched, and they continued to hold back progress even after independence.
It's like a cautionary tale within a cautionary tale. A stark reminder of how deeply ingrained those extractive institutions can become and how difficult they can be to shake off.
It really is. And sadly, this pattern isn't limited to Latin America. We see a similar story playing out in Africa, a continent that has faced some of the most brutal consequences of extractive institutions.
I was just about to ask about that. As we're talking about this, I can't help but think about the challenges facing so many African nations today. Is it fair to say that history continues to cast a long shadow in many ways?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And why nations fail makes it very clear. This is not about any inherent failings of the African people, their cultures, or their work ethic. It's about understanding the devastating convergence of historical forces and the institutions they left behind.
So it's about going beyond simplistic explanations, those lazy stereotypes, and really grappling with the complexities of history and how they continue to shape the present.
Exactly. For centuries, many parts of Africa struggled with weak state centralization, which made them incredibly vulnerable to exploitation.
Mm.
And then you have the transatlantic slave trade, which, as the book argues, was a major turning point, a critical juncture, but in the worst possible way.
Yeah, talk about a catastrophic collision of events. Internal fragility combined with this horrific external force. It's hard to imagine a more potent recipe for disaster.
You're right, and the slave trade wasn't just morally abhorrent, it was economically and institutionally devastating.
Mm.
Instead of fostering cooperation and trade between nations, it created this perverse incentive for raiding and warfare, all to fuel the insatiable greed of the slave trade.
It's like instead of nations working together to build a better future, they were pitted against each other in this horrific race to the bottom, a system that literally profited from their misery.
That's a powerful and accurate way to put it. And the legacy of those extractive institutions, amplified by the horrors of the slave trade, continues to cast a long shadow on many parts of Africa. It's a stark reminder of how easily the seeds of inequality can be sown and how difficult they can be to uproot.
This is heavy stuff for sure. But one thing I appreciate about the book is that it doesn't shy away from these difficult topics. And while it acknowledges the immense challenges, it also searches for those glimmers of hope. Are there any bright spots, any examples of African nations that have managed to buck this trend and chart a different course?
There are, and Botswana is a fantastic example. They've managed to achieve remarkable progress even in a region that has faced so many obstacles. The book points to their unique history and leadership as key factors in their success.
Okay, color me intrigued. What's so special about Botswana? What can we learn from their story?
Well, back in the 19th century, they had this really remarkable leader named King Kama. He seemed to understand that the old ways of doing things weren't going to cut it in the face of encroaching colonialism in this rapidly changing world. So he pushed for these really forward-thinking institutional reforms that modernized his tribe's governance and really laid the groundwork for a more inclusive and equitable society.
Wow, so he was kind of like this visionary leader ahead of his time. It sounds like he was trying to build a more just and equitable society, even as these powerful forces of colonialism threatened to tear everything apart.
Exactly. He understood that strong, inclusive institutions were key to their survival and their future prosperity. And crucially, those seeds of inclusivity that he planted weren't completely stamped out during the colonial period. King Kama and other leaders actively resisted, often through strategic alliances and this really savvy diplomatic approach. And this meant that when independence finally came, Botswana was in a much stronger position to build on those more equitable foundations.
It's a testament to the power of leadership, right? And agency. This idea that even when faced with what seem like impossible odds, people can make choices that ripple through history and shape the destinies of nations. It's a reminder that history may lay down the tracks, but it doesn't necessarily have to dictate the final destination.
I love that analogy. It perfectly captures the spirit of why nations fail. The book isn't just about dissecting the past, it's about understanding the forces that continue to shape our present and our future, and recognizing that we have the power to make different choices.
Speaking of the present, I'm curious to hear about other parts of the world. The book also delves into Asia, right? And Asia is so fascinating because you have this incredible diversity of cultures, histories, economic trajectories. It's like a microcosm of the world in many ways.
Absolutely. And Asia really highlights how those small differences in institutions can lead to such dramatically different outcomes, even within the same region. For instance, let's take a look at China. For centuries, they had this very centralized, very top-down, absolutist system of government.
Yeah, very hierarchical approach to power.
Exactly. And while this system had allowed for periods of strength and innovation, it ultimately made it much harder for them to adapt to the rapid technological advancements of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
So even though they were no strangers to ingenuity and invention, they kind of missed out on riding that wave of progress that propelled countries like England forward.
So even though China has this long and impressive history of innovation, Their institutions, in a way, held them back from fully capitalizing on those new opportunities.
That's a really interesting way to think about it, and it's a stark contrast to the experience of another Asian nation, Japan.
Oh, yeah, Japan. They underwent an absolutely mind-blowing transformation in a really short period, going from a relatively isolated feudal society to becoming a major global power as this economic and industrial powerhouse. It's incredible. How did they manage such a dramatic turnaround?
It all goes back to those critical junctures and the importance of adapting to change, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. You see, Japan, facing increasing pressure from Western powers, decided to take a different path. They underwent what's called the Meiji Restoration, which was a pivotal turning point in their history. It was like they came to a fork in the road, and instead of sticking to the familiar, well-worn path, they chose a different route, one that was bolder and ultimately more transformative.
So they recognized that the world was changing, and if they wanted to thrive, they had to change with it.
Exactly. And they were willing to challenge the old ways of doing things, to reform their institutions, and really embrace new technologies and ideas from other parts of the world.
And that willingness to adapt, to embrace change, even when it was probably pretty scary and uncertain, is ultimately what set them on such a dramatically different trajectory.
It's a really incredible example of how a nation's destiny isn't predetermined. Even within a context of really intense external pressure, Japan found a way to leverage a critical juncture to transform its institutions, and in doing so, completely transform its future.
Wow, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive, from plagues in medieval Europe to revolutions and industrial upheavals, from the Americas to Africa and Asia. It's clear that Why Nations Fail offers this really compelling framework for understanding global inequality. But if you had to distill it down, what are the biggest aha moments you'd want our listeners to take away?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think the most important takeaway is this. History isn't a script. It's not some preordained path that countries are forced to follow.
Right, like it's not just about geography being destiny.
Exactly. And it's not about certain cultures being inherently better than others either. It's about recognizing how these things we call institutions can set nations on very different trajectories. Sometimes those institutions act like a tailwind, propelling a country toward greater prosperity. And sometimes they act more like quicksand, keeping them mired in poverty for generations.
Okay, that makes sense. But I have to admit, it can feel a little overwhelming at times, right? Knowing that institutions, these often invisible structures, are so powerful. Like, how much agency do we really have if these forces, some of them shaped by events centuries ago, continue to exert such a strong influence today?
I hear you. It can definitely feel daunting. But here's the thing. Recognizing the power of institutions isn't about giving in to some sense of historical determinism. It's actually the opposite. It's about recognizing that we have a choice. We have the power to understand these forces, to see those patterns, to identify those critical junctures when change is possible.
So it's about becoming more than just passive observers of history, right? It's about becoming active participants in shaping those institutions that are going to shape our future.
Now you're getting it. And that all starts with being willing to ask some hard questions. What small differences, what seemingly minor historical events might be shaping our present circumstances, even if we're not aware of them? What critical junctures are we facing right now as a nation, as a global community, that might present an opportunity for us to make a different set of choices?
It's like the book gives us this amazing X-ray vision, right? We can suddenly see the bones, the underlying structures that are often hidden beneath the surface of events. And once we see them, we can start to understand how they work and how we might be able to influence them.
I love that analogy because that's exactly what Why Nations Fail does. It isn't just a history lesson. It's a call to action.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we're not just passengers on this ship, we're also the crew. We have a responsibility to understand the machinery, to chart a course, to work together to steer toward that brighter future.
On that note, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought, something to really chew on. We've spent all this time exploring these different countries, these grand historical narratives, but I want you to bring it home for a second. Think about your own country, the one you live in right now. Where does it fit into this big picture we've been painting?
Think about your nation's history, its institutions, its leaders. What small differences have shaped its trajectory, for better or for worse? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? And most importantly, what role do you, as an engaged citizen, want to play in shaping its future?
Because ultimately, building a better world starts with understanding the one we're living in. Well, that's it for our deep dive into Why Nations Fail, We'll be back next time with another thought-provoking topic. Until then, keep those brains buzzing, and as always, thanks for diving in with us.